Hello, this is Mark Reier, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 30th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, first article. Warsh's performance falls flat with markets as Fed holds rates steady. Kevin Warsh has made taming inflation the top priority of his tenure as Federal Reserve Chairman, but his hesitancy to embrace the possibility of higher borrowing costs has sparked a backlash. Early in Kevin Warsh's second news conference as chairman of the Federal Reserve, he laid out how the central bank would ultimately be assessed as it takes on one of its most challenging inflation problems in decades. The central bank was in the business of performance, he told reporters on Wednesday, after the Fed's decision to hold rates steady at a range of 3.5 to 3.75%. We are going to be judged by how we perform. Financial markets swiftly rejected Mr. Warsh's approach, which involved tough talk on inflation, but stopped well short of embracing the prospects of higher interest rates to quell price pressures. The response, primarily from the $28 trillion U.S. government bond market, was unequivocal. Markets expected more from a policymaker who has made taming inflation a top priority of his chairmanship. Long-term government borrowing costs shot higher as Mr. Warsh spoke, with the 30-year bond notching its largest one-day increase in more than a year, trading around 5.22%. It is at the highest level since 2007. The 10-year Treasury yield, which serves as the benchmark of borrowing costs around the world, also rose along expectations about inflation over a longer time horizon. Stock markets sold off too, even as investors pushed back the timing of potential rate increases until later this year. The markets initially interrupted the price stability tough talk as someone who was willing to take the necessary actions to address inflation, and then was surprised that there wasn't follow through, said Lael Brainard, who served as vice chair at the Fed until she left to become a top economic advisor in the Biden administration in 2023. Mark Cabana, an interest rate strategist at Bank of America, added, as a central banker, this is exactly what you don't want. You don't want the market questioning your inflation credibility. The chance of some kind of disappointment was elevated going into the July meeting, in large part because there was a vocal contingency of investors who were making the case for Mr. Warsh to deliver a surprise quarter-point increase. The odds of such a move were around 30% ahead of Wednesday's announcement. Three presidents from the regional banks thought that it was also the optimal decision to dissent against leaving rates unchanged. The rationale for a rate increase was that an aggressive move early in Mr. Warsh's tenure as chairman would help to cement his reputation as the inflation fighter that he strives to be. Mr. Warsh tried to maintain that image on Wednesday in his opening statement at the news conference. He said that where necessary and appropriate, we will not hesitate to act to squash inflation. He made clear that the Fed would, at least for the time being, not accept anything above 2% inflation, as measured by the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. He also repeatedly stressed that there was nothing inertial about the Fed's decision or strategy, even as it stood pat. Moreover, he pushed back on the framing of July's meeting represented a pause. But those elements of hawkishness, as Tiffany Wielding, an economist at PIMCO, The asset manager described it, were overshadowed by Mr. Warsh's unwillingness to lay out the conditions under which he would consider raising rates. In fact, he only briefly acknowledged that higher borrowing costs were a tool at the Fed's disposal to address inflation. Mr. Warsh also did not give any indication of how he saw the data evolving in coming months, nor did he make any specific mention of the Fed's next meeting in September as a potential platform to take action. In summation, he described the current moment as a period of watchful thinking, not watchful waiting. No forward guidance, no framework guidance, no nothing, said Ms. Wielding. That, coupled with Mr. Warsh's repeated mention that the Fed would focus on a wide range of inflationary measures, gave her the impression that the timing of any rate increase was highly uncertain. What was missing was the point emphasized in the minutes from Mr. Warsh's first meeting in June, which stipulated that if inflation stayed stubbornly high, most officials believed that some policy firming was warranted. Several policymakers built on that communique and stressed that they needed to see a deceleration in inflation soon. That omission was likely a strategic one from Mr. Warsh, who has rejected the Fed's longstanding practice of sending cues to markets on what the central bank will do and how it may react to incoming data. His view is that the Fed benefits from a direct and unfiltered signal from markets about what the central banks should do, rather than having officials' signals reflected back. On Wednesday, Mr. Warsh repeatedly referenced the recent tightening in financial conditions, which captured the availability of credit across the economy, as having given policymakers some comfort that we've got the ability and capability to deliver. Kurt Lewis, who served as a senior advisor to Jerome Powell, the former Fed chair, likened Mr. Warsh's strategy to trying to convey the same message that was conveyed in the minutes with both hands tied behind his back because of that rhetorical choice. Mr. Lewis reckoned that whether by force or choice, he will change how he approaches the news conference in the future, just because it will be easier for him to communicate, if he does so more directly. Mr. Warsh's ability to avoid another credibility test by markets will depend on if the economic data cooperate and keep a rate increase at bay, said Avisha Thakkar, head of macro and fixed income research at Schonfeld, a hedge fund. The view in the marketplace is that by September, if they don't deliver it and inflation proves stickier, then you will have failed that test, she said. For Ms. Brainhard, the risks are pointing in essentially one direction, meaning Mr. Warsh will likely under trial in the coming months, will remain under trial in the coming months. I think inflationary pressures are set to continue at an elevated level through the end of the year, which means that the case for a hike before the end of the year has certainly gotten stronger, she said. Okay, moving on to the next article. Families face anxiety, angst, as loved ones are deployed to fight Iran. As the war with Iran has continued, some are finding that the stress is bringing back old anxieties. A 4-year-old child began having behavioral problems when his father left for war. A wife whose husband works in Army intelligence is already dealing with heightened anxiety, even though he hasn't been deployed yet. Excuse me. A woman found this year that she is struggling to cope with the news of conflicts at home and abroad, nearly 20 years after she lost her fiancé in combat. More than 80% of military families have reported elevated stress from the war with Iran, driven by safety concerns, deployment changes, and the fear of escalation, according to a March poll of an estimated 200 families by Blue Star Families, one of the largest nonprofits supporting active military and veterans. As the war with Iran persists, mental health counselors say they are attending to more military families who are reporting stress and anxiety about a conflict that has taken the lives of at least 18 service members and wounded more than 400. We have tripled our caseload, said Hannah Sims, the founder of Rise Alone Therapy, a teletherapy provider that caters to the military and their families. Everybody is kind of on edge. There was the understanding that this was going to be a short-term deal, Sims added, noting President Trump's declarations at the beginning of March that the war could last 4 to 5 weeks. 5 months later, the war has flared again, following the end of a ceasefire agreement and then 2 weeks of bombing. The Strait of Hormuz has again been closed, sending gasoline prices over $4 a gallon. Diplomatic efforts are at a standstill, and the latest round of U.S. attacks did not seem to have deterred Iran. A Pentagon spokesman declined a request seeking details about how the military helps the families of service members cope with the stresses of war. But military officials have said that there are a variety of counseling and support services available, including a 24/7 service called Military One Source that provides free and confidential support. In interviews, military families said the war has triggered grief once thought to be healed. Some cope with feelings of guilt brought on by the conflict, a common emotion among military families, counselors said. Others lamented the lack of transparency and communication that has left them not knowing when their spouse, child, brother, or sister will come home. I don't know where he is, said Alicia Puente, a mother of 4 whose husband deployed in February as part of Operation Epic Fury. Ms. Puente's husband, who is in an artillery unit in the Marine Corps, calls home about every 3 weeks, she said. He does not have access to his personal device and must use a satellite phone on base to make the call, often waiting in a line of Marines doing the same. The communication lapses have roiled her children, who range in ages from 11 months to 12 years old. But Miss Puentes, who's 34, has developed strategies for her children to manage the absence. She keeps dolls and stickers of her husband at home. Her children love watching videos of their father, particularly those of him swimming with turtles. Still, Miss Puente has been in therapy to help with her husband's deployments. Said she has sought counseling for her 4-year-old, who is currently on a waiting list. I just knew that it was time to maybe ask for some more help for him, she said. Last month, Kelsey Smith, 35, started counseling to help cope with the stress caused by the war, even though her husband is stateside. She had struggled to control her emotions recently, blowing up over small things, she said. It's better, she said, adding that the therapy has helped, but overall, she said, I'm not better. Her husband is an intelligence officer for the Army and supports the Middle East campaign from a base in the Northeast. Since he started working around the clock, Ms. Smith began contemplating a tuxedo cat Lego set, about 1,700 pieces, to calm her nerves, she said. I know how hard my husband's working and the amount of stress he's under, Miss Smith said, who used her maiden name because of her husband's work in intelligence. So there's a level of guilt of just feeling like I'm not doing enough or not working as hard as he is. For veterans whose children are now in the military, a deployment can trigger anxiety as they recall their own deployments. Eric Dorner, who lives in Mountain, Wisconsin, is a veteran whose 27-year-old son, Brendan, just returned home after an extended deployment, serving 13 months as a sergeant in the Middle East. His contract officially ends at the start of August, but he could be deployed again anytime in the next 3 years. It is difficult because I knew he had already seen and been through traumatic things, said Mr. Dorner. I did struggle myself as a veteran, even though he went through way more than me. Kyle Harper, who is a communications advisor for Strategic Assistance Program for Survivors, a service that connects people who have lost loved ones in the military, restarted trauma therapy 3 months ago to help process her own grief. In 2007, her fiance, Army Staff Sergeant Michael Hollander, responded to a vehicle that had been struck by a roadside bomb in Iraq. As a medic, Staff Sergeant Hollander approached to offer aid, leaving his vehicle. He stepped on an IED and died as a helicopter rushed him to the nearest military hospital. For almost 2 decades, Miss Harper said she had been healing from that loss and has partly defined her adult life. She wears the engagement ring Staff Sergeant Hollander gave her on her right hand. She has completed 2 full Ironmans in his honor. When she learns of military casualties in combat or in training, Ms. Harper always feels a pang of grief, knowing how difficult it may be for those families. I look at the faces and read the names of people who served and died because I wanted someone to do that for Mike, she said. Ms. Harper said she returned to therapy to work with someone who understands the layers of loss. It felt strange to go back and talk about some of this stuff, she said, adding, but the world seemed really overwhelming again. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Okay, next article. Bipartisan anger grows as Pentagon's delayed Forever Chemicals cleanups. Hundreds of bases are contaminated with PFAS, which are linked to low birth weight and other risks. Politicians from both parties are demanding explanations. In December, Representative Jack Bergman of Michigan, a staunch ally of President Trump and MAGA defender, took to the House floor to praise America's military might, lauding its will to face down potential aggressors. Then his speech took an unexpected turn to pollution. We have much more to do, he said. High on the list, clean up PFAS, the harmful forever chemicals that pollute hundreds of military sites nationwide. The Pentagon must prioritize delivering environmental stewardship, to communities impacted by PFAS, Mr. Bergman said. In a fiercely divided Washington, there is bipartisan anger at the stalled progress of cleaning up toxic chemicals at military bases. The delays have emerged as a rare issue uniting Democrats and Republicans in their criticism of the Pentagon. PFAS-based foam has been used for decades in firefighting drills and exercises. It has left behind widespread contamination at military sites across the country. PFAS make the foam extremely effective in smothering fires, but service members and communities near military installations have for years contended with the harmful chemicals, which are linked to low birth weight, birth defects, and developmental delays, as well as an increased risk of some prostate, kidney, and testicular cancers. The New York Times reported in September that the Pentagon had quietly delayed its PFAS cleanups at nearly 140 military installations. Since then, the Pentagon has put off cleanups at nearly 200 sites. One location is delayed by up to 20 years, according to a follow-up Times analysis of the latest federal data. Dozens of members of Congress have demanded that the Department of Defense explain the delays and outline how it will protect service members and those living near bases. In July of 17, letter to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Democratic Representatives Kristen McDonald Rivet and Debbie Dingell of Michigan and Republican Representatives Jen Kagans of Virginia and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania said that it was unacceptable that DoD has continued to deprioritize its cleanup efforts. The four are co-chairs of a bipartisan PFAS task force that works on federal action to protect the public from the chemicals. We have real conversations, not bipartisan bickering, Ms. McDonald Rivet said in an interview. This is about the health and welfare of our troops. It's about protecting our soldiers in the homeland. The Department of Defense did not respond to questions about the cleanup delays. The revolt represents a rare political convergence in the face of Pentagon inaction on a matter that has become a major health concern for military communities nationwide. Perhaps most extraordinary has been the reaction from Mr. Bergman, a retired three-star U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant General. He has forcefully backed Mr. President Trump's America First agenda and has questioned the results of the 2020 presidential election that Mr. Trump lost to former President Joe Biden. Mr. Bergman has harshly criticized GOP candidates who have opposed any part of Mr. Trump's agenda and has supported investing heavily in border security and national defense. But he also represents Michigan's 1st Congressional District, home to several current and former military sites with heavy PFAS contamination. They include the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Oscoda, where decades of firefighting foam use severely contaminated water and soil, as well as the drinking water in the area. I will be direct. The community of Oscoda has endured more than a decade of contamination, broken promises, and institutional whiplash from the Air Force, Mr. Bergman wrote in a May 20th letter to the Pentagon, which was reviewed by the Times. I am running out of ways to explain to my constituents why the service they trusted with their community continues to treat them this way, he said. The cleanup is a daunting task, but because PFAS is highly soluble in water and some do not break down in the environment, they can migrate far from where they were released and persist for decades, said Jennifer Field, a professor of environmental toxicology at Oregon State University. The plumes can be very, very large, so the scale of contamination itself can be a challenge, Professor Field said. The chemicals have cast a pall of life in many military communities, said Tony Spinolia, co-chair of the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, an environmental group that has pressed the Department of Defense to prioritize cleanup at the former Wurtsmith base. It's not just drinking water, he said. It's the fish. It's the venison. It's small game. In a report by the Government Accountability Office last year, defense officials described the number of sites that must be assessed for PFAS contamination nationwide is overwhelming. They had little information on where PFAS might have been used at each location, they said, which meant they needed to test across entire installations, in some cases covering hundreds of thousands of acres. There's no widely available technology that quickly removes all PFAS contamination in soil and water. At Wurtsmith, the Pentagon discovered the contamination there in 2010 and was expected to complete its remedial investigation of the site in mid 2027. Only after that can potential cleanup begin. Next article, this is concerning the Russia Ukraine war. Russia hits Ukraine with missiles and drones, killing at least 8. President Zelensky of Ukraine said that a family of 5 had been killed at home in the latest in a series of large scale aerial assaults by Moscow. Russia pounded Ukrainian cities overnight with a barrage of missiles and drones that killed at least 8 people and wounded a dozen others, Ukrainian officials said on Thursday. The attack was the latest in a summer campaign of large scale aerial assaults as Moscow apparently seeks to capitalize on Ukraine's dwindling air defenses. The overnight attack pushed Russia's use of ballistic missiles to a new monthly record. Russia has fired 126 ballistic missiles at Ukraine so far in July, surpassing the previous record of 118 set in February, according to a New York Times data set based on figures from the Ukrainian Air Force. President Zelensky of Ukraine said Russian weapons had hit places across the country, from the western city of Lviv, where emergency crews searched for survivors amid the rubble of a destroyed building, to the eastern region, where a family of 5 was killed, including 3 children. 2 other children were pulled alive from the rubble, Mr. Zelensky said in a social media post about the strike in the southern region. It was an ordinary home, completely destroyed by a ballistic missile. During the attack, a Russian cruise missile also entered the airspace of Poland, a NATO member, according to the Ukrainian foreign minister. It was unclear whether the missile had struck Polish territory, but the authorities there said that an unidentified object had crossed into Poland's airspace overnight, and that police officers had later found a crater about 10 yards across, along with debris in a field in the country's southeast. Russian missiles have briefly entered Polish airspace during previous attacks on western Ukraine, but have not hit Poland itself. Any confirmed strike on a NATO member would sharply escalate tensions between the military alliance and Russia. The latest attack underscored Ukraine's growing vulnerability to Russia's expanding missile campaign. Mr. Zelensky has warned for weeks that Ukraine is running out of air defense capabilities, especially Patriot interceptors, the most reliable weapon that Western allies have given Kyiv to shoot down Russian ballistic missiles. Ukraine has pressed its Western allies for more Patriots, with Mr. Zelensky raising the issue again during a visit to the White House on Tuesday. But global inventories of the interceptors are under severe strain from multiple conflicts around the world. All of our partners know how they can help and what they can help with, Mr. Zelensky wrote on social media on Thursday after the overnight attack. Delays in assistance, delays in the delivery of anti-ballistic missiles leads directly to the kind of destruction and casualties that, unfortunately, we are witnessing today. Short of Western supplied air defenses, Ukraine has assembled a patchwork of air defenses to try to counter Russia's attacks. Those include mobile teams firing aging machine guns at low-flying drones, small drones intercepting larger Russian drones, and fighter jets launching missiles at Russian cruise missiles. Russia's ballistic missiles, however, present a far greater challenge that can only be dealt with by advanced systems such as the Patriot. This month, President Trump gave Ukraine permission to produce the Patriot interceptors under license, but experts say it will take time for Ukraine to start production. Ukraine is also developing its own air defense system, but it remains unclear whether it will be effective against Russia's ballistic missiles. All right, moving on to the next article. Cuba to Trump, we're open for business. A top Cuban official says the island won't negotiate its politics, but it is willing to talk investment, including from President Trump. Since a band of rebels in 1959, the island's government has largely been defined by its defiance of its far larger neighbor to the north, and its ability to survive the intense pressure that friction has provoked. But the current U.S. campaign, led by an effective oil blockade, is the most intense in a half century, and it is pushing the Cuban government to the brink. Tourism has cratered. The energy grid collapsed 3 times over 9 days this month. And other than a single Russian oil tanker in March, Cuban's allies have not been willing to test President Trump's order that no fuel be delivered to the island. Yet, more than 6 months later, the government is still intact, and Cubans are finding ways to get by. This month, we visited Cuba on an extremely rare journalism visa granted to the New York Times. In Havana, I interviewed Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernandez de Casio, one of the communist government's interlocutors to the United States. He said Cuba's main strategy to escape the Trump administration's ire was to enact a series of economic policy changes, including opening the country to foreign investment. Mr. Trump could even invest himself, he said. White House and State Department spokespeople called Cuba a national security threat and accused it of harboring terrorists, which Cuba denies. They blamed Cuba for the energy crisis, saying it sold off fuel to enrich elites and failed to maintain its electric grid. And they said Cuba's political and economic systems are broken and must change, though U.S. officials have not clarified what would be required to lift the blockade. The two sides acknowledge that their talks have made little progress. Many people, especially Cubans, are now watching closely for signs of what is next. The Trump administration seems to be demanding changes to Cuba's political system. Your government has said that is not on the table. What is? I can be sure that the government of the United States would not negotiate its constitution and political systems with another government. So there should be no surprise that Cuba is not ready to discuss its internal political issues with the United States. So what is the Cuban strategy? We introduced some changes in our economy a few weeks back. We believe they can allow us to cope. Yet, if the United States is trying to provoke humanitarian difficulties in Cuba, unfortunately, it has the power to. There's nothing Cuba can do. And if they lead to a military action against Cuba, we will suffer thousands of deaths. Probably there will be a bloodbath in Cuba. There will also be deaths of young Americans. But after all this damage is caused, what is the global gain by the United States? This is where we believe there should be some common sense within the American people. Russia delivered a single tanker of fuel in March, but no other country has challenged Trump's threats to not ship fuel to Cuba. Where are your allies? A coercive arm of the United States has proved to be very successful to tell a European, a Latin American, and Asian company that you cannot export your national resource to Cuba. It's a new world order. Do you expect more oil coming from Russia, Mexico, or Brazil? We do expect some oil to come from some parts of the world. We believe that the capacity of the United States to isolate Cuba and deprive countries of their right to export their own products cannot be forever. Trump has discussed taking Cuba. Is Cuba prepared militarily? It's absurd. What excuse can there be to carry out a military action that will cause death and destruction against a peaceful country? Now, regardless of how irrational it is, we would be naive if we did not prepare ourselves. If we do not update our military strategy, which is based on the involvement of the population as a whole, we understand the asymmetric reality in terms of technology and firepower, but our people will defend our country. We have weekly preparations for that. Okay, next article. AI data centers in space? A system to cool chips could help. Researchers at Caltech and Sophia Space, a startup, have developed a technology using solar power to prevent computer equipment from overheating in orbit. With a growing backlash against the proliferation of data centers to power artificial intelligence, there has been increasing interest in putting the energy thirsty operations in orbit. Now, researchers may have figured out how to overcome a major obstacle to that goal: cooling the data centers in space. The California Institute of Technology and Sophia Space, a startup focused on orbital space computing, announced on Thursday that they had received a patent for a cooling system that they say could help them launch data centers by the early 2030s, powered by 24-hour solar systems in space. The announcement is the latest effort to develop the use of solar power in space. This year, Elon Musk proposed sending up 1 million or so satellites to function as data centers, reducing the electricity and water they consume on Earth. Other big technology firms, such as Google and Jeff Bezos' rocket company, Blue Origin, have been developing similar projects, like the system designed by Caltech and Sophia Space. The satellites would require energy from solar power. It's just kind of exploding, said Sergio Pellegrino, co-director of the space-based solar power project at Caltech, who is working with Sophia Space. We need to become more comfortable with space doing things for us. Solar technology already exists in space. Spaceships and satellites use small panels for power, but nothing at the scale that Sophia Space and Caltech envision. It will be years, at least, for their system to reach orbit. But if it proves to be effective, researchers, technology executives, and energy companies hope that one day solar arrays in space could power your home or business. Solar power has grown as an electricity resource in the last decade or so, becoming cheaper and more efficient, while also offering carbon-free energy. But because solar power runs only when the sun shines, there is debate about whether it can meet soaring demand spurred by electric vehicles, heating and cooling systems, and most significant, AI data centers. The data centers in particular have angered nearby residents because they use a lot of land and have contributed to rising electricity costs and water shortages. Solar power in space would have 24-hour access to the sun's energy, making it a steady source of power like power plants that run on natural gas and other fuels. On Earth, a solar power plant requires batteries to extend the resource beyond daylight. But some critics of putting solar powered data centers into orbit, argued that it would add to the growing amount of trash in space, while increasing consumer costs for power. Some say it may also make the electric grid less reliable. The space-based mousetraps are just a distraction, said Bill Powers, an engineer in San Diego, who testifies as an expert witness on behalf of consumers before state utility regulators across the country. Still, with companies racing to reap rewards from the AI boom, they are going to great lengths to create infrastructure for data centers, even if some of those efforts never become a reality. In a June report on data centers in space, the World Economic Forum noted that finding the technology to cool computer chips would be an appealing pursuit because 70% of Americans oppose the construction of data centers in their areas. The report noted that space lacks air and water, which are typically required to rapidly cool computer chips. SOFIA Space devised a computer and data storage unit with a cooling system that uses a combination of tiles and solar power, which ultimately sends waste heat into deep space. The company said its system was cost competitive with data centers on Earth. SOFIA was born out of that kind of vision and that goal to provide energy and solve an energy crisis for the Earth, said Leon Aquilia, a co-founder of SOFIA Space and its chief technology officer. Rather than generate electricity in space and transmit that energy to the Earth, the solar power system would produce energy in space for an orbiting data center that would then send its data to Earth. A much easier and less costly feat, he said. Caltech continues to work on development of space, solar, and other academic institutions like Georgia Institute of Technology have teamed up with a South Korea solar company to advance the field. The Energy Department has been exploring space solar power generation for more than a decade. The most common designs use radio waves or lasers to transmit the energy to a receiver on Earth and then deliver it to utility substations. SolarN, a leading developer of the technology, said it was set to enter a power purchase agreement with a utility company for its system, which it aims to commercialize within the next decade. There's nothing technically preventing us from doing that, said Gary Spurnak, president and chief executive of SolarN. Okay, moving on, next article. Work halted at another office conversion in Midtown Manhattan. The Department of Buildings ordered work to stop on certain floors at 753rd Avenue. It's the third conversion project to have work halted since one became dangerously unstable earlier this month. New York City officials told developers this week to pause some construction at a high-rise office building in Midtown Manhattan over structural issues at the building, which is being converted to apartments. Inspectors with the Department of Buildings discovered on Tuesday that pieces of some steel columns at 753rd Avenue were welded together, which potentially weren't shown on the approved plans filed with the department, said Andrew Rudansky, a department spokesman. When asked to provide documentation about the welding, the contractor on site did not, Mr. Rudansky said. The city then directed the developers to stop all structural steel work on the 9th floor and above, according to the order. The order, which is dated July 28th, also directed the contractor to provide an engineer structural stability report to the city before work can continue. The building is at least 30 stories tall. Mr. Rudansky said there was no danger to the public, no orders to evacuate, and no structural distress. A spokesman for the developer, SL Green, said that the firm noticed the issue after initial preparation work for the project was done. The issues were in columns that already existed in the building, according to SL Green, and the firm had been working to update its conversion plans. The spokesman said there were no structural issues with the building. SL Green said it had already sought to get the order rescinded. The building is at least the third office conversion project totally or partially shut down by the city since July 7th. The buildings department issues some 7,000 stop work orders every year. On that day, two steel columns buckled at a large project on 42nd Street at the site of the old Pfizer building. It led to fears of a collapse and the evacuation of thousands. The incident rattled confidence in conversion projects, which have been lauded by public officials and the real estate industry as clever ways to repurpose old buildings and address the city's housing shortage. Inspectors with the building department have been conducting sweeps at conversion sites in the aftermath of the incident at the old Pfizer building at 234 East 42nd Street to ensure other projects do not have serious problems. Matthew Rockenbach, a spokesman for Mayor Mamdani's, said in a statement that office to residential conversions remain an essential part of addressing New York City's housing crisis. City officials do not believe the incident at the Pfizer building reflects an inherent risk with conversions, he added. Last week, they shut down work completely at a building in Lower Manhattan, 222nd Broadway, over issues with a horizontal concrete beam on the roof that had cracked and been repaired. Work remained on hold there on Wednesday. A spokesman for the project in Lower Manhattan, James Yoles, said at no point during construction has the building's stability been compromised. The building department also partially shut down work at 77 Water Street over issues they found during an inspection in July, including equipment being used without proper certification. The developer of the project, Van Barden, did not respond to requests for comments. Work was allowed to resume a few days later. Originally built in 1957, the building at 750 3rd Avenue is being converted into 639 residential units, according to a permit filed on April 8th. There's been no violations recorded by the Buildings Department until the partial stop work order on Tuesday. The contractor on the conversion, New Line Structures, did not immediately respond to requests for comment on Wednesday. Young Su, the director and chief engineer of Allen Margolin and Associates, an inspection firm, was listed on building department records as a third-party inspector responsible for ensuring structural work was conducted properly. When reached by phone Wednesday afternoon, he declined to comment and said he was unaware of any stop work order. Alfredo Armaro, 31, a welder in the project, said in an interview at the construction site on Wednesday that he had been on the 11th floor on Tuesday afternoon reinforcing columns when his foreman told his team to stop working. He said that the foreman told him that there was a paperwork issue and the team had to stop welding. Okay, next article. Conservatives like the liberal arts, actually. They just don't like the phrase. The term liberal arts does not have the most glorious reputation these days. Online, there's a starker pack of associations, unless degrees, or useless degrees, fake jobs, oat milk, pink hair, and Marxism. When a newspaper reports on college graduates struggling to find jobs, somebody asks how many have STEM degrees versus the usual liberal arts, like dance or sexual intersectionality, the Babylon Bee, which is like the onion, but with conservative commonplaces instead of jokes, runs the headline. Liberal arts degrees renamed non essential worker degrees. And imagines colleges admitting that the pottery, French literature, or zero gravity space station basket weaving classes you're taking are completely useless. Even the individual words are unpopular: liberal and arts. One educator writes about a rural college president who stopped using them after a neighbor asked, "What's wrong with conservative arts?" There are also some long suffering people who keep pointing out that these critics must be understanding what liberal arts means. One even took the Chronicle of Higher Education to task for how it used the term. In 2022, a physics professor named Chad Orzel grumbled about people constantly confusing the collection of academic disciplines shorthanded as liberal arts with the idea of liberal arts education. That's not a major. It's the simple idea that every student should study a broad range of topics, a range that, in any sensible formulation, includes math and science. Orzel is correct. Liberal arts traces back to ancient Greek ideas about teaching a full spectrum of knowledge. Our arithmetic, music, rhetoric, astronomy, etc., in order to cultivate agile minded men capable of wise self governance, not Poens trained for a single task. It's liberal as in free, not the much newer political label. The idea was sustained across centuries of Europe. People were writing about liberal artes in Middle English and built into the foundations of higher education in the United States, where Ben Franklin imagined students at the future University of Pennsylvania learning art and oratory and debating justice and injustice. But Americans have come to use liberal arts for loose sets of specific disciplines. One community college administrator wrote that some of his campuses used it for anything non vocational, while others used it for anything not math based. Fine arts and humanities, like philosophy, almost always count. Social sciences, like uh, anthropology, sometimes do. Law is curiously exempt. People point liberal arts at things that they consider indulgent or impractical. The proverbial basket weaving is not, despite probably being a trade. In meme after meme, STEM is presented as liberal arts utilitarian opposite, a lucky break for pure math where you can study stuff that makes literature look like HVAC repair. Okay, let's end with this last article. Dentists in Brooklyn exploited patients in pain, lawsuit charges. New York City sued two dental practices saying they offered patients high interest loans to pay their bills and also falsely said procedures were not covered by insurance. The dentists and their assistants often delivered the bad news when the patient was already in the treatment chair, in pain, and in no position to read the fine print, New York officials said. The patient, typically poor and older, needed thousands of dollars of work, and insurance would not cover it. The dentist would tell them, but there was a way forward. Just sign up for a convenient payment plan. But what the two dental practices in Carnacy, Carnarcy and Brooklyn were not telling the patients was crucial, the city said. The claims that the patient's insurance would not cover the procedures were often false, the city said. Convenient payment plans were essentially high interest loans with rates as high as 27%. Sometimes, the city said, patients were signed up for them without their consent at all. On Wednesday, the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection said it had sued the practices, Canarsie Family Dentistry and New York Family Dentistry, in state Supreme Court in Manhattan, accusing them of false advertising and deception and seeking restitution and other penalties. No one in pain should be treated like a payday, the agency's commissioner, Samuel Levine, said in a statement. When dental providers exploit New Yorkers who desperately need care, New York City will halt their predatory practices and hold them accountable. Neither practice responded to phone calls or emails seeking comment on the city's accusations. New York Family Dentistry, which has 3 locations in the neighborhood, one of which has a sign out front reading, "All smiles and insurance accepted," and Canarsie Family Dentistry, which has 1 location, are not connected, the city said. The city said that the practices pushed the credit products on their patients for one reason: they get immediate payment in full, right away. Melissa Iacan, the Consumer Protection Department Deputy General's Counsel, said. There's no waiting, no negotiating with insurers or accepting partial payments. The suit, filed on July 17th, details about a half dozen cases, histories. She said, and the city's expected to hear from many more patients who had been similarly hoodwinked. One patient, named in the suit, Carol Romaine, was told by the staff of Canarsie Family Dentistry that her insurance would not cover the extraction, crown, and antibiotics that they said she needed. The suit said the practice at first refused to try to submit a claim to Ms. Romaine's insurer and would not even provide her the procedure codes for her to submit a claim herself. So she was forced to choose between paying $1,500 out of pocket or tolerating the pain. While she was in the dental chair, the staff gave her husband a document to sign that he thought was necessary to submit a claim to insurance. But the couple later learned that it was a credit application and that the credit company had paid Canarsie Family Dentistry $3,000 on the spot that the couple was now liable for. Lola Parchment, a retired nurse's aide, came to Canarsie Family Dentistry in 2023 seeking relief from dental pain and filled out some form that she understood to be routine intake paperwork, according to the suit. She got a simple cleaning, which she believed her insurer would cover, but when the staff told her she needed thousands of dollars worth of work, she said she could not afford it and left. All they did was clean my teeth and tried to get me to borrow thousands of dollars I did not want to borrow, Ms. Parchment said in a phone call on Wednesday. In 2025, she got a letter from a collection company telling her she was being sued for $5,291 for charges associated with Canarsie Family Dentistry. I was shocked when I got the paper for me to go to court, she said. They're preying on elders and poor people. They're terrible. Yasmin Breeden, a 67-year-old woman on Medicaid and Medicare, went to Canarsie Family Dentistry for a partial denture installation and was told that all her remaining teeth needed to be extracted and replaced with permanent dentures. Rather than billing Medicaid and Medicare, the practice told Ms. Breeden she needed to pay $1,000 out of pocket immediately and take out a loan for another $5,000. The dentist pulled her teeth but failed to install the screws for the dentures properly, When her daughter tried to get the practice to correct the problem, she was told that Miss Breeden would need to take out another $10,000 loan. Within the last few weeks, Miss Inchan said, the practice contacted Ms. Breeden and her daughter again. This time, employees threatened to send her account to collections. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 30th issue of the New York Times. Your reader today has been Mark Grier. Thank you so much for listening.